Alright, so it looks like the Chargers roster is all set. So you know what that means. An in-depth look at all their latest moves and how it's going to affect them this season. So we're going to talk all the trades, cuts, and signings, and end with a win-loss prediction. Also, if you've been watching the channel for a while and been wondering where I've been, I don't know what to tell you. I live in Canada, so I have to get my summer in. But I'm back and expect a lot of videos coming up. Stick around to the end if you want to find out more about the future of the channel. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. First, let's obviously talk roster cuts. Obviously, Justin Herbert made the team, which I heard that joke a lot, and I think I don't need to hear it anymore. We all get it, he's pretty good. Overall, there weren't a lot of surprises, unless you count guys like Tre'mon, Morris-Brash, who was a training camp standout, but they ended up getting him back. It was definitely risky of the Chargers to let him test waivers and then add him to the practice squad, but that's probably his best place right now. He is an undrafted outside linebacker, so it makes sense that he needs to hone his skill still, even after a good training camp. It was disappointing to see Thomas Harper go, especially since it was to the Vegas Raiders, and their GM being Tom Telesco. If there's one thing you can say about Tom, was that when it came to undrafted free agents, he had an incredible track record. Hopefully Harper isn't one of those one who got away kind of guys, but we'll see. Even if he is, the Chargers look overall quite strong when it comes to the safeties. Another risky move was letting Jarrett Patterson test waivers. The running back was the leading rusher for the Chargers all preseason, and Greg Roman was gushing about him a lot during press conferences. I was definitely surprised they even tested him like that, but it makes sense now in retrospect with Haskins being available. Hassan Haskins, the former running back for Michigan, which obviously Harbaugh coach, he's more of a bruiser, and I think he's a good complement to Gus Edwards. So now the Chargers kind of have a good mix of running backs in their running back room. You have some good crossover between J.K. Dobbins and Kamani Vidal, and now Gus Edwards with Hassan Haskins. But still, I definitely want to see Jarrett Patterson get a shot. I've liked him ever since he was at Buffalo. I'm surprised he hasn't really been able to find his way into the league, but it's tough, and you never know with running backs when their chance comes, but they can often be late bloomers. And I can definitely see it with a guy like Jarrett Patterson, especially in the Greg Roman rushing offense. So I'm glad they kept him around, even if it's just for the practice squad for now. Going into training camp, I definitely wasn't anticipating Donald Parham to get cut. If anything, I wondered if he would play a similar role to Mark Andrews, but obviously, if anything, Donald Parham is even more injury prone than Mark Andrews. He was always a really fun Charger to watch because of how tall he is. But I'm also glad that they kept Smartt. I think Smartt has a lot of potential, especially in this offense. Also glad that even as a new coaching staff, they didn't just automatically try to find one of their other guys, and they've continued to develop him. I don't think anyone would have questioned them if they had gotten rid of a Staley fave, so good on them for seeing what they had with Smartt. The next big name cut is Isaiah Spiller, the former 4th round pick, who has been a abject disappointment as an NFLer. He came in the league with some fanfare because he was very productive in college, but his combine numbers were very unimpressive. Still, even with the bad numbers, you would think a guy with vision would show more of that on the field, but it never really showed up. Despite never really finding his footing in the preseason, he still had a spot on the practice squad until they got Jarrett Patterson back. As of this recording, he is a free agent, so I feel he'll probably get picked up, but I don't think there's going to be a clamor for him exactly. And overall, I think it was a really smart move by the Chargers to move on from him. The last of the big cuts was JT Woods, the former 3rd rounder. If you've watched my videos before, you definitely know that I was waiting for this. But also, I gotta say, I was intrigued by him as a corner. With his size and weight and speed, and a lack of tackling ability that be mitigated at corner, he seemed like a pretty intriguing prospect there. He has since signed in the Eagles practice squad, so it should be interesting to see because the Eagles seem to, have a history of shrewd moves. But I think Ortiz is no chump in that department either, so he probably wasn't too sure about him, and I think I'm fine with moving on from him. Now let's talk waiver claims and trades. So I already touched on Hassan Haskins, but I think there's some more to go over with him. As I mentioned earlier, he does make sense stylistically. I think he's a good backup for Gus Edwards, but I also don't think he's anyone I'd be rushing to, pick up in fantasy, obviously. I know there was a brief moment in the fantasy world where people were trying to talk him up as being a Derrick Henry replacement, but that obviously never materialized. So I think the move makes sense, especially since they're familiar with him being a Michigan guy, but I don't see it moving the needle much. Now let's talk the best move the Chargers made so far. That's the Taylor Heinicke trade. The Chargers gave up a 7th round pick to the Falcons, and it's going to be a 6 maybe based on certain conditions, probably playing time. I don't see that being a big issue. Regardless, not a lot to pay for a guy who's a legit spot starter in this league. And if anything, I would say he's probably one of the best spot starters. And the best part is he replaces someone who's probably the worst spot starter in the league, which is Easton Stick. And now that the Chargers are probably going to be pretty serious about making a playoff run this year, they don't want to have Easton Stick around playing potentially if Herbert's hurt again, because, they don't want another top 5 pick. Not to be rude, but I'm obviously still grateful to the Easton stick for getting the Chargers the top 5 pick. But still, getting a legit spot starter is going to be pretty helpful in a year where Herbert will be dealing with a lot of pain all season long. Another trade that the Chargers made was for Elijah Molden, a defensive back coming from the Titans. This time it was for a 7th rounder in the 2026 draft, so the compensation was pretty low. He's a former 3rd rounder who came into the league as a slot corner but has transitioned to safety. But if anything, he's not quite just safety. 274 of the snaps in 2023 were at free safety, while 222 in the box and another 198 in the slot. So I think that sounds like he's pretty versatile. I can see him being a factor in the Jesse Minter defense. Overall, just a low risk, good pickup that gives the defense even more depth. Now that we've gone over the big moves, let's talk about how it relates to the depth chart. Starting with the offense, the most interesting thing and what pops out to me first is the fact that Quentin Johnston is listed ahead of McConkey technically on the depth chart. That's not to say McConkey did anything wrong, but it's kind of an interesting vote of confidence. And I know depth charts aren't always the most meaningful thing, but it is also important to point out that they specified that J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards are co-number ones. So I can't help feel like there's some sort of message being sent here, and that Quentin Johnston has had a decent camp after a rocky start. Obviously, I don't want to get too excited, even as someone who has defended him in the past, because there definitely were some issues with this game. And honestly, watching him last year, I really felt like he needed like Freud to come back from the dead as a sports psychologist in order to get him right. But then again, Harper is full of all that self-help stuff, so I can see that really helping. His progress is definitely worth monitoring, especially week 1, to see, because it could go either way. And not to mention, he could be a pretty interesting pickup in fantasy. And as for the aforementioned co-number one between Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins, I feel like that's probably more to do with the fact that they have such distinct running styles, so it makes sense to consider them both 1A and 1B. It's more of a psychological tactic, I think, of anything from Harbaugh to make them feel like they're not in a complete competition. Still, even with that, I feel like Gus Edwards is probably going to be the more productive one of the two, and I think he's probably going to be used more in the red zone. And I don't know how productive J.K. Dobbins is going to be after all those injuries. As far as the offense goes, the obvious strength of it, I think, is the offensive line. Much was made about how weak the offensive line was, which I never really understood because they have some talent on there. And they only really added Bradley Bozeman, a journeyman center, and obviously the 5th overall pick. But outside of that, there wasn't a lot of moves there. And with that, they have a lot of depth. It's kind of amazing to look at now that someone like Jamari Salyer is a swing tackle, when just 2 seasons ago, he was their starting left tackle. I think there's a lot to be excited with this group moving forward. Next up, let's talk about the D. This is obviously the best part of the team. It's almost as obvious as saying that Justin Herbert made the team. Obviously, you gotta love the depth on the D-line. And yeah, the defensive tackles aren't necessarily the greatest, but there's some guys showing promise, especially a guy like Scott Matlock. And they're so good on the edge and deep that it won't really matter. Though it is a bummer that Joey Bosa is yet again hurt. But at least it's something he can play through this time. Either way, I'm definitely expecting them getting to the quarterback a lot this year. The corners are not looking necessarily that deep, and it's going to be interesting to see how ASJ assimilates himself into this defense. And same with Christian Fulton, who's had kind of a not great start to his NFL career. But the safety group is definitely looking really good. Obviously, you got a star like Derwin James, who can play multiple roles and do anything you pretty much want, and even be a plus pass rusher. Also, you have someone like Olowi Gilman, who's just steady as they come. And depth-wise, they have Tony Jefferson, AJ Finley, and the newly acquired Elijah Molden. That's a lot of chess pieces for Jesse Minter. So now let's talk record prediction. Post-draft, I had the Chargers going 13-4. And now after training camp, I think I'm going to maybe bump it down to 12-5. A lot of that injury obviously is pain tolerance, but I feel like it could affect them at least a little bit when it comes to the QB run, and that's a component of the Greg Roman offense, so that might hinder things, but not too much. And I expect the wide receiver room to not be as much of a weakness as it looks like now by the end of the season, kind of similar to the way the Green Bay Packers were last year. Not to mention they are in a division with teams that are starting Gardner Minshew and Bo Nix, especially Bo Nix, who apparently is the next Patrick Mahomes. So as I said earlier, from here on in, I'm going to be a lot more active. Part of it was because of some personal problems I was going through, but that's over now, and I'm ready to start doing up to 3 videos a week, potentially even more, depending. And if anyone has any ideas for content, definitely let me know in the comments. Thanks again for watching.